Now that I've given you a fairly solid overview of the PHP syntax and the language itself, now we can start digging into some admittedly more fun things. And we're going to start that out by taking a look at superglobals and how we can use them to process data as well as pass data from page to page. So in this lesson, we're going to be working in Sublime Text 2. I've created a directory called superglobals and an index file within it. So if I view that within the browser, we load it, there we go, now we're ready to get started. So an important thing you need to understand is that when you create a variable, it's not going to exist for the entire application, certainly not. Its only job is to exist for the life cycle of the page. For example, if I open up PHP here and we create a variable called name equals Joe, well that's certainly going to exist. I can echo it out here. And if I come back, yep, we're getting Joe, everything we would expect. We're familiar with this now. But of course, if I then go to another page, for example, now I will create about.php, and for the time being, we'll just copy and paste this. If I remove the PHP block and I try to echo out name, it works on index, but now if I go to about, we're going to get this undefined variable name. And of course that's the case. This variable isn't available in about PHP. It was created for index. So now we know that to some extent these variables we create have an expiration date, and that expiration is either when a page reloads or when you visit a different page within the website. So that then brings up the question when you're first learning, okay, well how do I pass values from page to page? And there's lots of different ways. One way would be to store your information within a database. We're not quite ready for that, but we will dig into databases fairly soon. Another way would be to pass it through the query string. So let me give you an example. I'm going to come back to Sublime Text 2, index.php, and now, rather than hard-coding this value in, we're going to get it from the query string. And to do that, we can use what's known as a superglobal array. So for example, if I do $_get, this is the get superglobal. That's how you would refer to it. And this can be used to fetch information from the query string. So to give you an example, let's go back to index.php. We can fetch key value pairs from the query string, and by query string, I mean anything that comes after the question mark within the address bar. And you've surely seen this. You're at a blog, and then you see a somewhat readable file, and then suddenly it goes into all of these key value pairs. ID equals 10,500, and category equals 12. All of these are key value pairs within the query string. So now, my key is going to be name, and the value, I'll just use myself for now, is Jeffrey. So now that alone is going to populate that $_get superglobal with all of the key value pairs within this URI. So for now, let's simply var dump the superglobal and see what we get. I'll reload the page and notice it is an array, good. And now it's an associative array, so we can access this array rather than using the index. We can actually reference it by the name or the key that we set. Now, if we want to add more, we simply separate them with an ampersand. So if we say name equals Jeffrey and job equals developer, now that array is going to be populated, and let's view the source to make it more readable. We have the name, and then we have the job. So now we can echo $_get name, Jeffrey, and of course if we change that to job, reload the page, now we're getting developer. So what's nice about this is, depending upon what's provided, we can fetch different data. And that's the way I want you to think of the GET request. It's used when you're fetching data. So for example, if I change job from developer to designer, that value will then be reflected on the page. But there's a couple of things that you need to be very careful about. The idea behind GET requests, or you'll hear it referred to as the GET verb, HTTP verbs, is that it's specifically for fetching data. You're not going to use GET to send data that will update a database, anything like that. You would use a different verb called post. For GET, it's simply maybe you want to get a specific item from Amazon. That could be a GET request. Maybe you want to get a specific blog article or blog posting. Then you could use GET. But there's a couple of things here that you need to be careful about. So for example, at the very top, we're going to replace it right here below the H1. And I'll put this within PHP tags again, and we'll get rid of this information at top. And then below it, we'll say subsection, just something to represent HTML that comes after this. All right, so now if we reload the page, we get designer. But what do you think we'll get if we remove job entirely? Let's try it out. Remove that. Now you're going to get this undefined index. So at this point, we are relying on the fact that there will be a job key available, But in this case, one was not provided. So you need to be able to detect this and proceed accordingly. Maybe if a job was not specified, you want to redirect to a generic page, or maybe you don't want to do anything at all. It just depends on the situation. But we can check to see if this exists by using isSet. So I could say if isSet $_get job, then echo job, else we can do something else like echo is not set. And that looks good. I'll make sure I close out this bracket here. And now if I run it within the browser, we're going to get is not set. But if we provide and job equals developer, now we get that value. So now we can detect whether items within this super global array exist. And this is very important. Going back to that blog idea, think about you have a page where you want to go to a specific article. So maybe it's article and it's going to be ID equals 5. What that would translate to is go into the database that has all of your blog articles and fetch only the one that has an ID of 5. And the way it would work would be that every blog article would have this unique ID. Well, then when we say this, we know how to fetch a very specific blog posting from the database. ID equals 5 will return one article, but ID equals 6 will return an entirely different article. So from that perspective, you can imagine that the ID key is incredibly important, because if we're on article.php, but there is no ID, then what is it supposed to display? Well, in that case, you would probably want to display the most recent article, or you could even redirect to index.php. And that's when you would use isSet. If isSetID, then get that information. Otherwise, and we will simply add it as a string for now, redirect somewhere. And to do that, you can use the header function, but we'll take a look at that in a future video. There we go. So now if I run it, we get redirect somewhere, but if we do have an ID equals 5, now we can, in this case, echo out 5 or fetch something from the database. Now, the next thing I want you to be very careful about is the idea of allowing users to provide data that you then interact with. So the rule of thumb is this: always assume that data that is taken from the user, because remember, anybody can edit this URL. They can change it to 10. They can do anything they want. So your job as a developer is to assume that all information received in this manner is dangerous. Assume that they are trying to hurt you. They're trying to affect your database. They're trying to break your website. And then with that in mind, you provide the necessary security so that in all instances, you'll be safe and you don't have to worry about that. So you might be thinking, well, you're overreacting. Nobody's interested in breaking your website. Actually, that's not true at all. And it's a best practice. If you go around creating code and distributing code that isn't implementing these best practices, you're going to be ridiculed, to be honest. So we will have entire sections dedicated to security, but I'll give you a quick example here. What if rather than ID equals 10, instead I do something like this? ID equals, and rather than entering a number, now I'm going to enter HTML. So now maybe I will enter an H3 that says changed. Now if I run it, take a look. That H3 was actually inserted into the page. So now what we thought was we were echoing out information or we were grabbing an ID, but what we instead got was some kind of HTML. Or maybe they could close out the body tag prematurely and try to break your code in some way. So this is why we always need to be cautious and assume that the user is trying to harm us. And in that way, it forces us to make our application as secure as possible. So the solution in this case is we're going to run everything we echo from the query string through a function called HTML special chars. If I switch over to this page on php.net, and by the way, a little tip, whenever you want to access information about a function, you go to php.net/function name. So for example, you want to learn about array map, add it that way, and now you immediately have that information. That's important to know. Don't go to the website, don't search for it, just add it to the URL. All right, let's come back and take a look at HTML special chars, or special chars, however you want to pronounce it. So the basic idea here is it converts all of your special characters to the HTML entities. So you might be thinking, well, what are HTML entities? Well, think about it this way. What if you wanted to display an HTML tag, but you didn't actually want it to function as a tag, you wanted to display it on the screen? For example, here is the code tag, something like this. Well, if I run this in the browser, What we've inadvertently done is we've opened up a code tag right here, and now that's going to be represented for everything that follows it. So how could we display just that tag name? And generally what people do maybe for blog postings is they will change this to its HTML entity version, which is &LT semicolon. Now if I run it, now we're actually able to get that because it's not being interpreted as an HTML tag. And that's one of the things, among others, that HTML special chars does. So if we were to change this, and we opened up PHP and we echoed HTML special chars, and now we place the code within there, we're going to get the same thing. If I reload the page, yep, we're getting that exact same thing. If I view the source, we can see that it changed the opening and closing angled bracket. And these are entities that you need to memorize. It'll take a couple of days, but then I couldn't imagine not knowing what that represents. &LT semicolon is open angled bracket, and &GT semicolon is a closing angled bracket. But now that's not all that this function does. It changes a handful of things. For example, it'll change the and symbol to &AMP semicolon. It'll change single and double quotes. And then here's the information about the angled brackets. So this sounds like this is what we need, because what we want to do here, if I reload the page, is make it so that any HTML here is not going to be interpreted as HTML. All right, let's try it out. Now, and I will go ahead and get rid of this paragraph tag here, is rather than echoing that out alone, we don't want to do that. We want to assume that they're being malicious. So I'm going to echo HTML special chars and add it that way. Now if we run it, you'll see that we're being okay. They are trying to be rude or malicious, but that's okay because we have protected against this and converted any special characters to their HTML entity versions. So with that out of the way, the final thing we want to do in this lesson is send information from page to page. So watch what happens now if I have an anchor tag here, and I will comment all of this out for now. And this anchor tag is going to go to about.php. We'll give it a value of about, run that, that looks good. That will go to about.php, but we are getting this undefined variable name. So let's go ahead and remove that for the time being. Okay, so now that looks good. We have this file that links to about.php, but now we want to send information to that page. So let's get rid of this subsection. And now, if it's something just for the purposes of fetching data, then we can use get. So I will add to the query string and we'll say name equals Joe. So now if I run this, it's still going to about.php, but we are sending information through the query string. Then at that point, about.php can echo HTML special chars. Notice we're just getting in the habit of doing that when we're grabbing information from the query string. And we'll do get name. Reload the page. Now we have Joe. And this is one way that you can very easily pass values from page to page. And trust me, there's lots of them. You can use sessions, which you'll learn about. You can use a database. You can cache information to a text file. But when you have simple transfers, information that is completely safe and isn't in any way changing that requested data, that's when you would use get. So this finishes up the first part of learning about HTTP verbs. We've taken a look at get. So the takeaways from this lesson are use get for fetching data. Don't ever use it to send information through that may be used to update, for example, a record in the database. That's not what it's for. It's for retrieving and displaying information. Information that won't change, information that is safe. But that said, there will be times when you do want to change information. Somebody enters some data into a form and you want to use that information to add a new record to the database, or you want to update a specific row within the database. And for these sorts of tasks, we don't want to use get. Instead, we would use post. And that's what we will learn about in the next lesson.